In the previous movie, we saw the basics of how to control the scaling of a map using the UV parameters in the material shading network. However, we also need to control UV parameters in the space of the object itself. And each object has its own UV coordinate space. And just because we've set up the size of something in the material editor does not necessarily mean it's going to be the right size in our 3D scene. So for example, in this version of the scene, I've got the floor here, and it just has default mapping coordinates. It started out as a line, and I extruded it, and I just enabled generate mapping coordinates. And now we've got, like I said, default coordinates. But we want to be able to specify the scale of a map and its placement on the surface. We do that with a UVW Map Modifier. With that object selected, in the Modify panel, go to the Modifier list, scroll down, and add a UVW Map Modifier. At first, nothing changes, because the modifier is designed to stretch the mapping coordinates to fit the available area of the object. So the object was 20 meters on a side. And down here in the parameters, we see length and width have been automatically set to 20 meters. But we can change that to whatever we want. So for example, we can plug in a length of 10 meters and leave the width at 20, and now we see that it stretched the mapping on our object. And if we look at this in a wireframe view, we can see the mapping gizmo. I'll click in that perspective view to give it focus and press F3 and reselect the object. This orange box is the mapping gizmo. I can go over to the UVW Map Modifier, open up its sub-object modes, and select the gizmo, and the Move tool is automatically activated. And I'll just move it directly up in the Z-axis, and then re-enable shading in the viewport with F3. When we move this up in the Z-axis, it doesn't change the mapping, because the mapping is projected down onto the surface orthogonally, or at right angles to this plane. However, if we move in Y, we're changing the placement on that object. Okay, I'll set the length and width both to 10 meters. And now we've got a square gizmo once again. You might be tempted to scale the gizmo, and that's not illegal, but it's not recommended. If we go in here and select the Scale tool and scale that mapping gizmo, we are changing the scale in our final result. But now our length and width down here are still reading 10 meters. However, this gizmo is no longer 10 meters on a side. And if we right-click on our Scale tool, we won't see any scale factor applied. So that's kind of really problematic. I do not recommend scaling the gizmo if you can help it. So I'm going to undo that with Control-Z. So now I know that the gizmo is scaled at 100%, and the length and width over here are going to determine the size of the gizmo. All right, so I'll go back to my Move tool, maybe go to the top view and position this. I'll right-click so I don't lose my selection, and maybe position that, and maybe set the length and width to something else, maybe 2 meters on a side. Press Tab and enter 2 meters. Get in close, and I can precisely position that. Maybe if I want those tiles to exactly line up with the wall there, I can make that happen. Get in close here on the perspective view and see how that works. Now we're barely scratching the surface with the UVW Map Modifier. We're applying a planar projection. But over here you can see that there are different types of mapping. If you've got a cylindrical or spherical object, you might choose those map types instead. But for something like this floor, the planar mapping is exactly what we want. That's how to apply mapping coordinates on a per object basis using the UVW Map Modifier.